roaring waves that can tower higher than an apartment block. Ripping wind that howls at speeds as fast as a supercar. Rain that lashes and whips the ocean into fury. This is Mother Nature at her scariest. For centuries, humans have taken to the ocean for travel, but to get to where we need to go, occasionally we've had to pass through the eye of the storm. On this channel, we've looked at the stories of some ships which didn't make it. In fact, through history, there have been untold thousands of vessels sunk in monster storms. This is a handful of some of the most gripping we've covered on the channel. The movie prop that became a museum ship, only to be sunk in a hurricane in 2012. The cargo ship that disappeared at sea, presumed sunk by a monstrous rogue wave. The migrant ship broken apart on the rocks with horrendous loss of life. The container ship that steamed into a hurricane with serious maintenance issues. And finally, the top-heavy warship on its first ever mission toppled in a storm with nearly all hands lost. These are the incredible tales of ships lost in horror conditions, and we begin with the sailing ship Bounty. The ship was a favourite visitor to US ports, a beloved museum vessel and training ship that harkened back to the glory days of sail. But these horrifying photos show what happened when she encountered Hurricane Sandy in 2012. Bounty looked like a vessel from the 1700s, and for good reason. She was really a movie prop based on the infamous vessel of the same name from the 1780s. The original ship's captain, Bligh, was a tough master, and on a mission out to the British West Indies, his crew, led by acting Lieutenant Fletcher Christian, seized control of the ship and set Bligh and his loyal men adrift at sea. They, however, survived, and the Bounty mutineers were hunted down before the ship was burned. It became fodder for Hollywood films, and one star-studded movie was about to begin production, but first it needed a ship. So it was that in 1960 an unusual commission was received by the Smith and Ruland shipyard of Nova Scotia. Using Admiralty blueprints and plans, they were to attempt something that had never yet been done: rebuild a large ship purely for a movie. It couldn't just be a set piece either. Just like the original, the replica would need to be able to sail to Tahiti for filming. 200 men worked over nearly a year to exact specifications, and the result was spectacular. A nearly perfectly accurate recreation of the original HMS Bounty. Crucially, the ship had to be sized up to double the original size so the film crew could actually fit on board. That wasn't the only concession either. The replica was every bit a modern vessel below the waterline, with bilge tanks and pumps and diesel engines turning two propellers. The replica Bounty set off for the very first time and reached Tahiti in late 1960. Starring in the film as Fletcher Christian was Hollywood legend Marlon Brando, and ironically Brando, like Christian, fell in love with the location and said that every day, as soon as the director said cut for the last time, I ripped off my British naval officer's uniform and dove off the ship into the bay to swim with the Tahitian extras. Often we only did 2 or 3 shots a day, which left me hours to enjoy their company, and I grew to love them for their love of life. But the replica Bounty was not intended to live a long and happy life. Even though she was seaworthy, she was just designed to star in the film, and the final scene called for the ship to be burned. But Brando, who had just spent so much time on board and who had grown to love it, used his sway to prevent the destruction, and the replica Bounty survived. The movie had been made with love, an impressive eye for detail, but it still flopped at the box office. And sitting there as a lone, awkward reminder was the replica. Brando had prevented its destruction for the film, but fate would soon show he had merely postponed the inevitable. The Bounty replica went on to have a long Hollywood career, until finally, in 1993, the ship was donated to a foundation where she could offer educational cruises. The connection with Hollywood didn't end there though. One of her more notable roles after the original film for which she had been built was as a vessel in the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. Into the 2000s, the ship underwent a number of restorations and overhauls. By 2010, Bounty was a regular sight at tall ship events and ports around the world, and then, just 2 years later, she was destroyed. In late 2012, meteorologists were alarmed to find that a long, low-pressure front in the Caribbean Sea was likely to develop into something much worse. Their worst fears were realised when it formed first a tropical storm and then a terrifying, unstoppable hurricane. Winds of up to 115 miles an hour, 185 kilometers per hour, ripped roofs off of houses in Jamaica and Cuba and deluged Haiti, Puerto Rico and others with monstrous rainfall. In late October, the hurricane swung around and began to head west-northwest for the US mainland. The storm was named Hurricane Sandy, and sitting at anchor directly in its path was the sailing ship Bounty. Aboard the ship was Captain Robin Walbridge with 15 of his crew. Walbridge had been Bounty's skipper for years. He'd formed a devoted and passionate group of volunteers, and they trusted his judgment implicitly. Most of them, though, were incredibly inexperienced, and 10 had been with the ship for only 6 months or less. Walbridge gathered his crew and told them the situation, that a storm was coming and likely to hit within the next few days, but he surprised them with his plan. He wanted to sail Bounty out. The ship was in New London, Connecticut, and Walbridge had intended to sail the ship down to St. Petersburg, Florida. He still intended to complete the voyage, but had decided to swing out further east to avoid the worst of the storm. He told his volunteer crew that a ship is always safer at sea than in port, and he planned to sail around the hurricane, but made it clear that the position was voluntary and they were not forced to join him. But nobody declined. Their ship had been thoroughly modernised with all the standard safety equipment you could expect on a vessel like this, including EPIRB positioning beacons, rafts, immersion suits and radio equipment. On October 26th, the Bounty set off. At sea, the ship rocked and rolled as she navigated the peaks and troughs of the monstrous seas. Captain Walbridge was maintaining a steady stream of communications with those back on land. Already he was dealing with criticism from concerned family and friends, but he dismissed it. The Replica's Facebook page began to post regularly to assuage any fears and provide updates. A post on the 26th announced the departure and drew surprise, with one commenter saying, "Please be careful, Hurricane Sandy may morph into a Frankenstorm." The next day, Bounty was making nearly 7 knots in tall seas far off the Virginian coast. Walbridge had tried to steer his ship further east and clear the worst of the storm, but still, contact couldn't be avoided. They expected to face the storm front within the next day or so. The ship's Facebook page made a post reminding followers that the vessel was in capable hands and ended by saying, "Bounty's current voyage is a calculated decision, not at all irresponsible or with a lack of foresight as some have suggested. The fact of the matter is, a ship is safer at sea than in port." The next day, the storm had drifted closer, and Walbridge may have then begun to understand the severity of the front. He messaged back saying, "I think we're going to be into this for several days. The weather looks like even after the eye goes by, it will linger for a couple of days. We're just going to keep trying to go fast and squeeze by the storm and land as fast as we can." The Bounty was rocked by nearly 30-foot waves and hit with nearly 90-knot gusts. The crew found it difficult even to remain upright, with some suffering some nasty falls, and then, at 6 p.m, with a failing engine and the worst of the storm at large, Captain Walbridge sent a distress call. On October 29th, 2012, Coast Guard helicopters were greeted with a terrible sight: the battered remnants of a once proud ship. Bounty's masts were snapped like twigs, her spars twisted and her sails torn. Her crew had abandoned ship some 15 hours earlier, and all but 2 had been recovered after an epic rescue mission through the night. The 2 missing crew included volunteer crew member Claudine Christian and Bounty's captain, Walbridge, and the helicopters frantically searched the waves looking for any sign of them. Remarkably, Claudine was a direct ancestor of Fletcher Christian, who had led the mutiny on Bounty back in 1789. In this way, 2 ships with the same name, separated by 220-odd years, had both suffered terrible fates. The decision to take Bounty out into the eye of the storm was heavily criticised, but sometimes ships are caught unprepared or have no ability to avoid the worst of the weather. Such is the case with the cargo ship Munchen, which, in 1978, was swallowed up by the sea, never to be seen again. Only a few chilling clues give us some idea of what might have happened the night that Munchen met the storm. The München, or Munich, was a modern cargo ship built for Hapag-Lloyd. It was designed to carry barges and effectively became a ship designed to ship other ships. The Munich was built in 1972 and was a 37,000 gross registered ton ship, about 857 or 261 metres long, somewhere in the size range of the Lusitania. In December 1978, the ship set off on a routine voyage from Bremerhaven in Germany for Savannah, Georgia in the USA. Since the month prior, a bad storm had been raging in the North Atlantic, so the Munich's crew knew, or thought they knew, what they were heading toward. The ship was thoroughly modern, very safe, and designed to handle the North Atlantic at its worst. That kind of ship, called an LASH carrier, is renowned for its flotation ability and was, at the time, considered to be practically unsinkable. Now, where have we heard that before? Munich set off into the storm, but it would never be seen again. At just past midnight on December the 11th, the ship's wireless operator was chatting with a friend on another ship and reported bad weather and even some mild damage to the Munich. Despite this, all seemed well and the ship continued on. But then, at 3 AM, things changed when garbled SOS calls were picked up by ships in the area. The conditions must have been playing havoc with the radio because little could be discerned except the Mayday call and the phrase 50 degrees starboard. This chilling detail takes us back to the Queen Mary, which also rolled over to 50 degrees but was able to right itself. Munich would not be so lucky. The ship's distress call seemed to stop and a search was initiated, but it was hampered by the bad weather. Through the next day, chilling radio signals were detected. One amateur radio operator overheard a voice in English but with a thick German accent. The signal was weak and garbled, but the operator heard Munich's name and call sign. Later that night, 10 more weak Mayday signals were received by a US station in Spain, again garbled but referring to 28 persons aboard. Munich had departed Germany with a crew of 28. That night, Munich's call sign, DEAT, was received by the same station and a Dutch tug. Next day, the wind speeds had dropped somewhat and a larger search could be put underway. 4 aircraft and 17 ships took part, and then they started to find things on the ocean. First, an empty life raft was recovered by the British freighter King George. Then Munich's fleetmate, the Hapag freighter Erlangen, found and identified 3 of the Munich's barges. Over the next few days, 3 emergency buoys, 3 life rafts, a barrel, and 5 life vests were either sighted or recovered from the ocean, but they were all empty. On December 20, the search was formally called off, but the company Hapag and the West German government continued to search, being aided by some 80 other ships. On February 16th next year, a passing ship spotted a flooded, damaged lifeboat, and printed on it was the name Munchen. This was the last thing ever seen of the ship. Investigators had very little to go on but that damaged lifeboat, with the block tackle still attached, but it told a very vivid story. Parts of the block's tackle, the pins usually hanging vertically, had been bent and twisted by some enormous force, enough to rip the lifeboat off its mountings entirely. At the time, the existence and occurrence of rogue waves was misunderstood, so the loss of the ship was put down to bad weather. But in time, the issue was revisited. All the evidence pointed to a horrifying fact, that Munich had been the victim of one or several rogue waves that night. As the ship battered its way through the storm, it likely plunged into a trough on the reverse side of a wave, just like Lusitania and Michelangelo had done. The wave would have smashed down onto the deck, torn the lifeboat off of its davits, and then ploughed into the bridge, smashing windows and possibly disabling the crew. Without steering or crew on the bridge, Munich may have drifted broadside into the storm waves and begun to list at an alarming angle. That distress call had mentioned 50 degrees to starboard. The ship floated this way, dead in the water for hours, being battered by waves as the crew inside clung on for their lives. But in the end, help could not arrive in time. Munich would have rolled, maybe even totally capsized, and flooded in short order. It was a horrifying end for the ship and her crew, and today, the Munich remains undiscovered, lying somewhere down there on the sea floor, a testament to the fearsome power of Mother Nature. Storms have been the bane of ships for long before the 20th century. In the 1800s and before, life at sea was an even dicier proposition, with many ships simply disappearing, just like Munchen did. There was another clear and present danger to sailing ships loaded with migrants back then: the world's coastlines. With razor-sharp rocks and pounding surf, these could have a ship dismantled in mere hours. Running into the rocks could be a death sentence, and so it was with the Cataraqui, a migrant ship loaded with hundreds of hopefuls looking for new lives in Australia, but destined instead for a horror encounter with a remote island and its devastating, rocky coastline. Cataraqui was a sailing ship, a bark, built in England in 1840. She was absolutely typical of the hundreds, if not thousands of ships of that kind that were sailing to and from Australia at the time. See, in the mid-1800s, Australia was still a relatively new British colony, and the government was keen to establish more of a foothold on the continent. Assisted immigrant schemes were put into place where families seeking to establish a new life away from the grime and muck of England's cities could try their luck in an entirely new continent and society. There were a few downsides though, especially the trip out. The voyage to Australia was really tough, and conditions were nothing short of awful. The ships leaked and rolled violently in the high seas, and passengers not yet used to travelling at sea were sick the entire way. The decks ran thick with vomit, and passenger quarters were cramped and dimly lit. Many sailing immigrant ships simply disappeared in storms, never to be seen again. To sail to Australia was to risk your life. Cataraqui was tiny, only 138 feet or 42 metres long, and 802 tons. But still, in April 1845, into her decks were crowded 369 immigrants and 41 crew. 120 of the hopeful immigrants were married with families, and the ship carried 73 children. In April, she set out from Liverpool, bound for what is today Melbourne, Australia. For months, the ship laboured in rolling seas and high winds, slowly making its way under Africa, then across the Indian Ocean. Conditions were far from perfect, and one crewman even fell overboard and was lost. Approaching Australia, the crew were faced with a unique issue. This was well before the days of GPS navigation, radar, or anything like that. Bearings and navigational readings were taken from the sun and stars, and it took competent officers to translate the readings into a position on the ship's charts. After months without seeing land, knowing your exact position was extremely difficult. It's made even harder when the weather is rough or blowing a gale. The crew knew that they were approaching the south coast of Australia and plotted roughly where they thought they might make landfall. Meanwhile, down in the passenger quarters, the two ship's doctors, both brothers named Carpenter, had been hard at work. On the voyage, 5 children had been born and 6 others had died. Such was life in the golden age of sail, when voyages took so long to complete. Cataraqui had left in April, but only began to near the southern coast of Australia in August. On the 3rd, the boisterous weather had grown into a full gale, and the ship was forced to heave to, riding the storm out, not making any progress forward until it had passed. The passengers inside must have been tossed around and frightened witless by the pounding seas and rolling ship, but Cataraqui was designed to survive exactly this kind of treatment. But there was an issue. Conditions had been so bad that Captain C.W. Finlay had not been able to take a navigational reading for 4 days. The ship was being battered around like a cork in a storm, and they had no idea where the shore was. And to hit it would spell absolute disaster. With seas running mountain high and the wind blowing a gale, the ship groped around in the darkness until about 4 AM on the morning of August 4th, when there was a terrible crash. Cataraqui had hit a reef off the shore of King Island on the approach to Port Phillip Bay. The captain and crew of Cataraqui had navigated without sighting land for weeks, if not months, to the exact point of making landfall and arriving successfully. They were only 1 day out of their destination, but instead of being able to sight land, they now ran afoul of jagged, razor-sharp rocks, and the ship ground hard, driven into the reef by the thunderous oceans. The hull immediately began to flood, and the passengers panicked. And what unfolded next almost defies description and is best told by one of the few survivors, the ship's chief mate, Guthrie. The scene of confusion and misery that ensued at this awful period, it is almost impossible to describe. All the passengers attempted to rush on deck, and many succeeded in doing so until the ladders were knocked away by the workings of the vessel. When the shrieks from men, women and children from below were terrific, calling on the watch on deck to assist them. The crew were actually mostly up on deck at the time of the collision and immediately got to work. Because the ladders leading up and out of the passenger quarters onto the deck were knocked away, the crew began to tie ropes and haul passengers out bodily, one by one. It was a mammoth effort, but in the end they got a few hundred up on deck. But escaping the flooding hull was one thing. The upper decks offered no shelter from the raging sea. Waves broke over the ship and swept passengers away in their dozens. At 5 AM, just an hour after the grounding, the ship rolled totally onto her port side, with huge waves roaring down the ship's deck and washing away the lifeboats, spars, and even part of the ship's superstructure. The captain, crew, and any remaining passengers held on for dear life, and Captain Finlayson ordered that the masts should be cut away to try to right the vessel. Somehow the crew managed to do it. The masts were all cut off, but despite this heroic effort, the Cataraqui was stuck fast on its side. Passengers caught below in the hull drowned, when the ship inevitably filled totally with water. A few hundred people now clung desperately to the side of the ship, exposed totally to the storm. Now, all they could do was try to wait to outlast it. Chief Mate Guthrie recalled, "As the day broke, we found the stern of the vessel washed in, numerous dead bodies floating around the ship, some banging up on the rocks. Several of the passengers and crew, about 200 altogether, were still holding onto the vessel, the sea breaking over and every wave washing some of them away." Incredibly, they clung on from 5 AM when Cataraqui rolled to 4 in the afternoon with no hope of escape. To jump into the water would mean almost certain death because the seas were so high that you'd be ground hard into the rocks. Then, in the late afternoon, something horrifying began to happen. Cataraqui had been subjected to unbelievable stresses, withstanding the full force of thunderous ocean waves for hours. With a groan and a crack, the ship began to give way, and then she split in two. Immediately, around 100 survivors were thrown into the waves, and anybody left holding on huddled around on the remaining section of the ship. With the ocean surging around them, they attempted to fashion a buoy to float out to the shoreline, but it became tangled and it broke up in the seas. Then the ship began to break up beneath their feet, even more, flinging more into the ocean until there was just one section of the ship's bow or front left poking out above the waves, with just 70 people left holding on. Unbelievably, this group clung onto the ship until daybreak the next morning, but when the sun rose, only 30 were left. A party, including one of the Dr. Carpenter brothers, attempted to set off in the only remaining lifeboat, but it was immediately capsized and they were all lost. Then the bow section began to break up, and Cataraqui was finished. With only 20 left holding on for dear life, whatever ropes they'd fashioned to hold them to the wreck were undone to give them a final chance at life. Chief Mate Guthrie grabbed a plank of wood and plunged into the raging ocean. The plank helped carry him over the worst of the rocks, and he was somehow washed up alive on shore. He found another man, a passenger, who'd also miraculously survived, and then a smaller group of frightened, shivering crew. The survivors were tended to by a resident of the island who'd seen chunks of ship floating by and figured there had been a wreck. In the end, the survivors were stranded on the island for 5 weeks while the storm abated and a rescue could be organised. In total, 9 men, 8 crew and 1 passenger survived out of a total complement of 423 souls, and not a single woman or child made it. (2015), and the cargo ship El Faro reports that it's entering the thick of a Category 4 hurricane. Just hours later, all communications with the vessel cease, and it becomes clear something is horribly wrong. Investigations would prove that the crew of El Faro had the odds stacked against them from the start that night because their ship was horribly maintained, and the storm they found themselves pitched against overwhelmed their vessel with frightening ease. As El Faro cast off and made way, the weather, naturally, began to deteriorate. The first day passed uneventfully. By the time September had given way to October, the mood aboard the El Faro had shifted. Dark clouds loomed low on the horizon, and the wind began to howl with increasing ferocity. Joaquin was no longer a distant threat. It was a living, breathing beast of a storm, and it was closing in fast. It was now a Category 4, with winds exceeding 130 miles over 209 kilometers per hour. The ship began to lurch and groan as the waves grew larger, and the ocean became a churning mass of fury. On the bridge, Captain Davidson remained resolute, maintaining constant communication with the shore and receiving updates on the storm's path. His plan was to skirt the edge of Joaquin, but the storm proved unpredictable, and its intensity was far greater than anyone had anticipated. Joaquin was unlike any storm Davidson had encountered before. It seemed to defy expectations, shifting course unpredictably and gaining strength at an alarming rate. What had initially been a manageable front now threatened to overpower even the most experienced captain and crew. On the early morning of October 1st, an El Faro crew member, Danielle Randolph, sent a nervous message home to her parents saying, "Not sure if you've been following the weather at all, but there is a hurricane out here and we're heading straight into it. Winds are super bad and seas are not great." As the ship pressed on, the waves grew higher, crashing against El Faro with a force that reverberated throughout the hull. The wind howled like a living entity, whipping across the deck and making even the most mundane tasks difficult. El Faro's progress slowed as the engines struggled against the mounting waves, but then disaster struck, and they failed altogether. Now this is a death blow for any large ship. Loss of propulsion means the vessel cannot point its bow into the worst of the wind and the waves. It's left completely at the mercy of the ocean and can be battered about like a toy in a bathtub. Being hammered from all angles, El Faro was completely helpless. Water had begun to seep into the cargo holds, causing the ship to list dangerously up to 15 degrees onto her side. The crew must have fought valiantly to keep the ship afloat, sealing off flooded compartments and attempting to restore the power, but the situation was spiralling out of control. Early in the morning of the 1st, Captain Davidson called Tote Maritime's emergency line.
Thursday morning, 0700, we have a navigational incident. I'll keep it short. A scuttle popped open on T-deck, and we were at some free communication of water go down the three holes. Had a pretty good rest. I want to just touch it, contact you verbally here. Everybody's safe, but I want to talk to you.
Are you connecting me through to a QI?
That's what I'm getting right now, is seeing who is on call, and I'm going to get you right to them. Give me 1 second, sir. I'm going to put you on a quick hold. So 1 moment, please. Okay, sir. I just need your name, please.
Yes, ma'am. My name is Michael Davidson.
Ship's name?
El Faro.
Spell that?
Oh, man. The clock is ticking. Can I please speak with a QI? I have a marine emergency, and I would like to speak to a QI. We had a hull breach. A scuttle blew open during a storm. We have water down in 3 holes with a heavy lift. We've lost the main propulsion unit. The engineers cannot get it going. Can I speak with a QI, please?
Yes, thank you so much. 1 moment.
In the face of the circumstances, there was little that could be done. The storm was too fierce. Helicopters could be swept from the sky by the wind speed alone. El Faro and her crew were on their own. The crew continued to battle the elements, but the odds were stacked against them. The El Faro, once resilient and steadfast, was now a helpless giant battered by waves and wind. The containers in the cargo holds broke free, crashing into one another as the ship tilted further to one side, all the vehicles and trailers slamming into the bulkheads with every roll of the ship. The crew knew that the only hope of survival lay in keeping the El Faro afloat long enough for rescue teams to reach them, but with each passing minute, that hope must have grown dimmer. The flooding in the cargo holds worsened, and the list of the ship became more severe. Then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, sometime around 7:20 AM, the radio and the phone lines from the El Faro went silent. Incredibly, despite the horrendous conditions, the US Coast Guard actually launched a daring search and rescue operation, with HC-130 Hercules and Jayhawk helicopters soaring out to battle the same weather that El Faro had. The Coast Guard cutter, the Northland, braved the waves later in the day, and despite insane winds up to 190 kilometers or 115 miles per hour, they searched a huge swathe of ocean for the ship, but to no avail. Soon, on the 4th of October, Hurricane Joaquin abated, and at last conditions improved enough for a larger search. From above, an orange life ring was spotted by an aircraft. Back ashore, families waited, sleepless and on pins and needles for a scrap of good news, for days. But then all hopes were sunk when a bloated and battered body in heavy storm gear was spotted from the air, but not recovered. Then search crews spotted rescue suits, broken life rafts, and even an empty, swamped lifeboat. It was clear that the worst had happened. The El Faro had gone down, swallowed by the raging ocean. The ship, along with all 33 souls aboard, was lost. All that was left were scattered debris fields across hundreds of miles of ocean, and no one body was ever recovered. The loss of the El Faro sent shockwaves through the maritime community. How could a modern cargo ship equipped with the latest technology be lost like that? The questions piled on, but the answers were slow in coming. One thing was certain: something had gone terribly wrong. The implications would change the industry forever. It was up to the NTSB, the US National Transport Safety Board, to launch an investigation and figure out what had gone wrong. But first, they needed to find the wreck. A US Navy ocean-going tugboat, the Apache, set out with a towed side-scan sonar to sweep the sea floor from above and find a wreck that may match El Faro's dimensions. Sure enough, after over a week of searching, a contact was made with a huge hulk on the sea floor. A remotely operated vehicle was sent down to film, and out of the murk, at 15,000 feet of depth, nearly 5 kilometers deep, the name El Faro appeared on screens, and the ship had been found. The NTSB and the US Coast Guard began piecing together the events that led to the sinking, and the findings were sobering. Nearly a full year after the sinking, the NTSB was provided a shocking, tragic clue. The vessel's voice recorder, similar to the black box of an aircraft, had recorded the last conversations aboard the ship after the radios had fallen silent. Investigators listened as from El Faro's bridge, Captain Davidson struggled to coordinate his crew and effect an evacuation. His ship was sinking, but the wind and the seas were so formidable that abandoning ship seemed like a horrifying prospect. He called out, "Bow is down, bow is down," before calling to his crew on the ship's radio system, "Get into your rafts, throw all your rafts into the water, everybody get off the ship, stay together." The ship, laden with cargo and with massive, voluminous holds, sank like a stone. In his last moments, Davidson struggled to help a crewman from the bridge as it flooded. "You're okay, come on," he called out. The crewman responded, "I need a ladder, a line, I need someone to help me." Davidson called back, "I'm not leaving you, and it's time to come this way." But then the recording stopped. The voice recorder and Davidson's final commands painted a much clearer picture for the NTSB about the ship's death throes. It became clear that a combination of factors had led to the tragedy. First was the decision to sail into the path of the rapidly intensifying storm. This was a critical error. Captain Davidson was an experienced and confident skipper, but the confidence in his ship and her abilities to navigate around Joaquin had been misplaced. In fact, the US Coast Guard and the NTSB put nearly the entire blame for the disaster on Captain Davidson's head. He had died trying to save his crew. A valiant final effort to be sure, but they should not have been there in the first place. Their ship was not as capable as they might have hoped. First, clues came from former crew members who told investigators they were shocked El Faro had gone to sea at all that September because of what they called holes forming in the ship's structure. They called El Faro a rust bucket. An examination of her sister ship, the El Yunque, revealed that the issue was not just restricted to El Faro, but the entire fleet. Patches of rust had been allowed to eat through critical bulkheads. The shocking lack of maintenance flew in the face of conventional maritime practices, and of course, it's the captain's duty to ensure that all's well with the ship. But the operators, Tote Maritime, were censured for this critical lack of maintenance across the fleet, and El Yunque was scrapped shortly afterward. Then, the NTSB's investigation threw an incriminating charge at the US Coast Guard. That the USCG authorised ships like El Faro to carry and use open-topped lifeboats, which would prove hopelessly inadequate during a storm. Without a roof or any kind of protection from the elements, crew members would be as good as dead in open-top boats like that. In fact, there was very little practical difference between them and lifeboats found on ships all the way back in the 1800s. The NTSB also criticised Captain Davidson's decision-making. He had ignored his crew's warnings and requests to alter course, and soon it was revealed he was making decisions based on incorrect information from a simple, private commercial weather service called Bon Voyage. It's easy to understand and use, but in doing so he'd ignored the National Weather Service's hurricane warnings and steamed his vessel straight into Joaquin's path. With El Faro at the mercy of the storm, the ship's structural integrity was pushed to the maximum, but she was badly maintained, full of holes, and in terrible peril. A simple scuttle, or hatch, failed, allowing ingress of huge amounts of water which could flow rapidly through the ship thanks to corroded bulkheads and pipes. The resulting list meant the engines couldn't sustain the required lubrication pressure, and they failed, essentially dooming the ship. The NTSB found the final nail in the coffin. El Faro lacked even a simple, approved damage control plan. The ship had blundered into a horrendous storm, lacking even the basic tools required to deal with the kind of punishment she was subjected to, all except for her crew's rugged determination and grit. They had fought to the end. In response to the disaster, a series of reforms were implemented to improve the safety of ships and their crews. The NTSB and the Coast Guard issued recommendations that led to sweeping changes in the industry, including stricter regulations on ships' maintenance and more advanced weather monitoring systems. The disaster also highlighted the need for improved training for ships' crews, particularly in emergency procedures around crisis management and damage control. But one of the most significant changes was the revision of the Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS regulations, particularly concerning the design and functionality of the lifeboats. New rules were established mandating that vessels of El Faro's type and age had to be equipped with enclosed lifeboats that were capable of withstanding severe conditions at sea. The open lifeboats that had been standard on many ships, including the El Faro, were now recognised as totally inadequate in extreme weather. The tragedy had shown that in a storm as fierce as Joaquin, these lifeboats offered little protection and virtually no hope of survival. They could be swamped and sunk in a minute or less. There is, of course, a lot more to the El Faro story. If you've enjoyed this overview and want to find out the full story, head on over to our friend Sam and his channel Brick and Mortar for a spectacular documentary on the ship and the unbelievable chain of events leading up to her loss. It's one of my favourite videos he's ever done. Today, the El Faro lies over 15,000 feet beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, resting on the seabed, far from the shore her crew had battled to reach. She's a silent monument to the 33 souls who went down with her, yet another ship whose broken wreck reminds us of what happens when we ignore reason and challenge the might of nature. Ships generally need to be expected to survive bad weather at sea. They're usually designed with seakeeping in mind, and if they can be controlled, they can usually ride out the worst of it. But if a ship is poorly designed and top-heavy, then things are almost always destined to go wrong. HMS Captain was a new kind of turret battleship designed by Cowper Phipps Coles, an eccentric British engineer and former gunnery officer who believed that the warship of the future was an ocean-going turret battleship. It brought him into conflict with the chief naval designer, Edward Reed, and a fierce kind of feud between the pair was born. Phipps' vessel, HMS Captain, was built and accepted by the Royal Navy in 1870, but her design was tragically top-heavy, and her builders had accidentally added hundreds of tons of weight during construction. The stage was set for a disaster of tragic proportions when Captain steamed off in a squadron and was quickly lost in a storm. On September 6, 1870, Captain was cruising in a squadron of 10 other warships, a combined force of vessels from both the Channel and the Mediterranean squadrons out of Vigo, Spain. They were both steaming and sailing off the west coast of Spain at Cape Finisterre, a rocky peninsula often at the mercy of the Atlantic Ocean's legendary temper. Sailing in the squadron were Monarch, Warrior, Hercules, and other big names from the early days of British ironclad battleships. In command of the entire exercise was Admiral Alexander Milne aboard his flagship, the Lord Warden, and that morning he stepped aboard Captain to inspect her since she was something of a novelty and he was totally unfamiliar with her. With the two formations of ships in column, Milne inspected almost every inch of the warship, no doubt led by her captain, Burgoyne, and her designer, Coles, who was actually aboard for the exercises. But then, a blow came on, and the sea began to increase. Milne and his flag officers struck out in their boat for the Lord Warden, but Burgoyne tried to get them to stay, worried that the conditions would be too much for the little boat. But happily, the Admiral and his men made it back to their ship, and it would prove to save their lives. With the wind freshening and a breeze coming in hard, the squadron forged ahead. Milne observed clearly that the sea was washing over Captain's deck, and that she heeled alarmingly from side to side. The squadron had their sails set, but slowly they began to reduce canvas as the wind's strength rose up to a force 7 blow. The barometer began to fall, the rain fell and the sea rose angrily. By 1 AM, it was a full gale, and all square sails had been taken in, the ships relying on their engines and staysails to keep their bows pointed into the waves. Milne gave the signal for open order so the ships could disperse and reduce the risk of collision in the dark, and the two columns spread apart. The Admiral watched HMS Captain battle the seas with the wind on her port bow, the ship listing hard over to starboard, but as the darkness spread and the night wore on, he could eventually just see her dim bow light in the distance. Then, sometime in the night, it blinked out, obscured, he thought, by rain and sea. With a dangerous cross-sea and with only very limited sail, the Lord Warden battled onward through the night, and by the morning the gale had abated. The squadron had scattered, and soon enough 10 ships were accounted for, but one was missing. Thinking that the captain had proceeded to the rendezvous point, the squadron made steam and sail, but there was no sign of her. A search effort went underway, with the big warships gliding to and fro over miles of empty sea. Then there came ominous sightings. First, HMS Monarch found a top-gallant yard, a very important spar from a ship's sailing rig. Then Admiral Milne's Lord Warden found another yard, still with the sails attached, and then finally, later that day, a kind of debris field was discovered. Battered and smashed cutter boats floating upside down, more discarded yards and booms, and then the body of a sailor with his name, Rose, stitched into his shirt. Sodden and battered floated a Union Jack flag, which was quickly fished out of the ocean. Everybody knew immediately that the captain had been lost. Burgoyne, the celebrated Victoria Cross recipient, was gone. So too was the ship's designer and greatest advocate, Cowper Phipps Coles. Nearly 500 men were unaccounted for, and in fact, Milne's first report said that the ship had gone down with all hands, and what might have happened to her would probably remain a mystery. Except, fortunately, he was incorrect. A boatload of 18 men was found, and they had miraculously survived the battering of the heavy seas in their small, wooden, open-top boat, and the story they told was frightening and damning. Around midnight, they said, Captain Burgoyne ordered all mainsails furled, but it was too little too late. Captain was rolling to and fro, and the press of so much wind on even a small part of her spread of canvas was extremely dangerous. In fact, a survivor said she was only under her topsails and her staysails. Captain lurched hard onto her side. Burgoyne called out, "How many degrees does she heel now?" The answer was chilling. 18, somebody called. She lay on her starboard side with water crashing over the bulwark, washing men away as they tried to hold on for dear life. Others were holding on high up overhead in the masts in the battle to reduce canvas and save the ship, but it was all in vain. With a roar and a hiss, the ship rolled onto her beam ends and then completely capsized, trapping anybody below decks and flinging anybody above deck into the ocean. It's a miracle anybody survived at all. In fact, there was no time to lower any of the lifeboats, and those lucky 18 men clambered into one that had simply broken free of its lashings. The ship sat bottom up briefly, with dozens clambering on top of the keel. Captain Burgoyne was thought to be among them, until shortly after, as little as 3 minutes later, she slipped below the surface, and that was that. Nearly 500 men were dead, and Captain, the Royal Navy's newest warship, was at the bottom of the ocean, along with her inventor. Immediately, all eyes turned to the Admiralty and the ship's builders, lairds. It was a very uncomfortable situation with a huge amount of public scrutiny and attention. A court of inquiry was immediately convened, and the Admiralty was extremely unimpressed. Chief Constructor, Edward Reed, had been fully aware of Captain's deficiencies since the start. Remember, he had refused to even use the word approved when considering Captain's designs. The findings of the inquiry quickly absolved the Navy and blamed the builders entirely, saying that a miscalculation on the part of Laird through which the ship floated deeper than was intended, a discrepancy which the controller described as a serious and unexampled error in construction calculations. Now, this was exactly the kind of Admiralty whitewash you would expect the Navy to produce in the face of an outraged public, but the truth was much more complex. It's true that the Navy had tried to distance itself from the Captain's construction, putting full responsibility on Laird's, the builders, and Coles, the designer, to create the ship. But in this, they overstepped. Coles had wanted Admiralty supervision for the ship's construction, but the Admiralty was so keen to wash their hands of the damn thing that they refused. They did appoint a kind of overseer to make sure the material was quality and up to scratch, but not the material's weight. In the end, Laird's used quality material that was simply too heavy for the ship's design. Reed never used the words approved in reviewing the designs. Instead, he marked the drawings not objected to, but many of those drawings introduced factors to the design which added to the vessel's weight. If the Admiralty had just gone above and beyond the basic requirements and cooperated with the builders and Coles, if they'd even taken more than this cursory interest in the ship they were going to be accepting delivery of, then maybe the weight issues wouldn't have slipped under the radar. An inclination test, that is a test which measures how far a ship can roll before it's lost, was completed, which showed that Laird's calculations were in fact correct. The ship would be lost if she rolled more than 21 degrees. But the papers weren't marked urgent. The results were delayed, and when they were finally published, they were never given to Admiral Milne. For his part, Reed had resigned his position in office and said, "I wish the court to believe that my actual departure from the office at length did not arise from this cause, but it had its weight in all that has happened, and I had the strongest reason for not keeping up a systematic assertion of the dangers incurred in the Captain." He was under extreme pressure. In fact, in a final interaction with Captain Burgoyne, Reed had said prophetically, "I don't want to say any more against her, but I'm glad that it is your fate, and not mine, to go to sea in her." Cole's supporters in government and the public were shocked, but the man was dead, and he couldn't defend himself. In my opinion, it is true that Captain's design was dangerous. The low freeboard was an issue, and it invited big seas to wash over the deck and swamp her, and Coles needs to take a significant portion of the blame. But if the Admiralty hadn't simply tried to wash their hands of the ship's development, if Coles and Reed's and Packington's professional pride had been swallowed, and if they'd all worked closer together with Laird during the construction, maybe the weight issues could have been caught, and Captain's major problems may have been resolved on the stocks. 472 men may have been saved, and Captain could have gone down in history, not as a disaster, but as a curious footnote, a prototype to compare against the HMS Monarch, and then probably just be relegated to use as a hulk or a reserve training ship. In the end, HMS Monarch proved to be the star. She went on to have a successful career before being broken up for scrap all the way later in 1905. Coles had been right in that the turret ship was the future. Eventually turrets became the norm, and battleships boasted all manner of weird and wonderful turret layouts. They were finally standardised with the HMS Dreadnought in 1906, but that's a story for another day. So, where is Captain now? Well, we know, of course, she sank off Cape Finisterre. In August 2022, an effort to rediscover the ship instead turned up 4 unidentified wrecks, and it's the 4th that best matches the Captain's general dimensions and layout. She's suspected to lie in some 1,700 metres, nearly a mile of water, at the bottom of the ocean in an area that has probably protected her from trawlers and the worst of the ocean's corrosive effects, and it's hoped the Captain would be in good condition. And an effort led by maritime historian Dr. Howard Fuller from the University of Wolverhampton is trying to raise funds to go back out to the 4th wreck and explore it, hoping to lift the veil and shed light on HMS Captain for the first time in nearly 155 years. But for now, she sits in darkness, undisturbed by humankind, a symbol of the uncertainty of experimentation, the danger of bluster, but more importantly, a warning of what happens when we refuse to cooperate.